Welcome to the Supply Chain Dialogue, Season 4, Episode 5. I'm Daniel Helmig, and if you've been following along, we've been exploring why achieving net zero Scope 3 emissions by some more realistic time frame to curb further climate change, and I mean 2040, is more challenging than simply implementing best practices and ticking boxes. We covered the standard paradox, where more measurement mean less action. We explored the economics of inaction, where traditional cost-benefit analysis systematically kills climate investment. And we examined the policy paradox, where regulations focused on Scope 1 and 2 barely touch the Scope 3. Today we're tackling something that might hit a bit close to home for many of you, which is why throwing technology at the problem often makes things worse, not better.
As your AI co-host, I'm getting a bit antsy. Are you now going to tell the listeners that technology is the problem?
No, Amy, you're safe. Technology isn't the problem. The problem is what I call digital displacement, the tendency to substitute technological solutions for operational transformation. It's like buying an expensive gym membership workout tracking app, then wondering why you haven't lost weight while sitting on the sofa scrolling through your fitness data.
So we're talking about companies that digitize their emissions tracking but don't actually reduce emissions.
The research data indicate that this is happening at scale. Let me share something fascinating, and by fascinating I mean alarming. Companies have invested heavily in supply chain industry 4.0 technology, showing no statistical significant improvement in actual emission reductions compared to companies that didn't.
Wait, that can't be right. Shouldn't better data, better visibility, and better analytics lead to better outcomes?
That's what every technology vendor promises. However, here's what actually happens. The company invests millions in SaaS or AI-powered supply chain visibility platforms. The platform generates beautiful dashboards showing real-time carbon emissions across the supply network. The sustainability team presents these dashboards to the board. Everyone feels very modern and data-driven, and then nothing happens.
Because seeing the data isn't the same as acting on it.
Precisely. In many cases, the investment in the technology displaces the resources needed for the operational changes that would make a difference. This is the innovation theater version of the compliance theater we discussed in episode 2.
Innovation theater, I like that. Can you provide a specific example from the research?
One mechanical engineering company, let's call them MECCO, because I can't reveal their actual name, invested $3.2 million in a blockchain-based supplier transparency platform. Brilliant technology. The platform could track components from raw material extraction through 6 tiers of suppliers with immutable carbon footprint data at every stage.
Sounds impressive.
Oh yeah, it was impressive. The dashboards were gorgeous. You could drill down to see the carbon impact of a single bolt in a specific assembly. The CTO won an industry award. But here's the thing, 2 years after implementation, their Scope 3 emissions had actually increased by 7%.
How is that even possible?
Because the visibility showed them the problem, but they didn't have a strategy to fix it. The suppliers with the highest carbon footprint were also the most competitive and had the longest relationships. The data said these suppliers are killing your carbon targets, but the procurement team said yes, but they're also the ones who can deliver at the price and quality. Meanwhile, the company that didn't invest in fancy technology but simply started requiring carbon reduction commitments of their top 50 supplier contracts, they reduced Scope 3 emissions by 18% over the same period.
So the low-tech approach beat the high-tech approach.
Not quite. The issue isn't high-tech versus low-tech. The problem is whether the technology serves as a catalyst for transformation or substitutes for it. The best performers in our research were companies that implemented targeted technologies specifically designed to enable operational changes that already committed to making.
Can you unpack that a bit more? What's the difference between technology that serves transformation versus technology that substitutes for it?
Let's compare 2 automotive suppliers. Company A invests in an enterprise carbon accounting platform, costs $800,000 in total over 5 years, tracks emissions across thousands of data points, generates compliance reports for every regulation. The sustainability team spends 60% of their time managing the platform. Company B invests in 150,000 euros in a simple supplier engagement portal. Fundamental technology, essentially a structured way to collect carbon data and track reduction commitments from suppliers. But the sustainability team, together with procurement, spends 80% of their time actually talking to suppliers, negotiating renewable energy clauses, and redesigning logistics routes. After 18 months, Company A knows precisely how much they're emitting. Company B has reduced emissions by 23%.
So, Company A confused measuring with managing?
Yep, this is absolutely rampant in most industry sectors. I was recently in a meeting where a procurement director said, and I quote, "Once we have complete visibility into our Scope 3 emissions, we will be able to start addressing them." And I had to bite my tongue not to say, you already know your biggest emission sources. You've known them for 3 years. You don't need better data. You need to bloody well do something.
You didn't actually say that.
No, I have learned my lessons regarding the rules of communication in a corporate environment decades ago. Still, I took him aside after the meeting in the hallway. There's a pervasive belief that perfect information is a prerequisite for action. It's not. In fact, our research shows that companies that wait for perfect data before acting typically end up never acting.
This reminds me of something you mentioned earlier in the series, the Pareto principle. Would you say that applies here?
In most manufacturing companies, 20% of suppliers account for 80% of Scope 3 emissions. You don't need blockchain and AI to identify those suppliers. A fundamental spend analysis in industry emission factors will get you to 90% of the way there. But instead, companies invest in platforms that can theoretically track emissions from thousands of suppliers. When engaging deeply with the top 50 would deliver far more impact.
So what you're describing is a kind of sophistication trap.
That's a perfect term for it. Companies pursue sophisticated solutions because they feel more corporate, more serious, more defensible to the board. It's much easier to present a 2 million technology investment proposal than to present a plan that says we're going to have uncomfortable conversations with our top suppliers about changing their energy sources, and some of them might increase prices, refuse, call you up, or talk to the press.
The technology investment feels like progress without the difficult trade-offs.
And technology vendors are brilliant at enabling this avoidance. Every pitch deck promises that their platform will drive behavioral change or engage supplier transformation. But platforms don't drive behavioral change. People drive behavioral change. Platforms just make data look pretty.
Okay, but surely some technologies actually do help with decarbonization. You can't tell me that real-time emissions monitoring or AI-powered route optimization don't have value?
Of course they have value when they are part of an operational transformation strategy. The research shows that technology investments are correlated positively with emission reduction in only one specific context: when they are implemented after the company has already committed to particular operational changes and the technology is selected to enable those changes. For example, there was a logistics company, I call them Logistec, that committed to reducing delivery emissions by 30%. Only then they invest in a route optimization AI. The AI didn't decide the strategy, the AI enabled the strategy. And it worked brilliantly because everyone understood that the technology was a tool, not a solution.
So the sequence matters, strategy first, technology second?
We often see the opposite. Companies acquire technology platforms hoping they'll illuminate the way forward. It's like buying professional chef knives hoping that they'll make you a better cook. They won't. They just make you a person with expensive knives who still can't cook.
That's a painful metaphor for anyone who's splurged on kitchen equipment. So what does the research say about why companies fall into this trap?
Our data suggests several factors. First, technology investment feels more controllable than operational changes. You can specify requirements, issue an RFP, and implement a platform. Done. Operational transformation requires negotiating with suppliers who have their own priorities, designing processes that have been in place for decades, and making uncomfortable trade-offs. Second, technology investments are easier to justify financially. You can calculate an ROI, or at least project one for a software platform. How do you calculate an ROI of having 50 difficult conversations with suppliers? You can't. So traditional financial evaluation methods favor technology over transformation, especially when later you might have higher cost with the suppliers.
Wait, that connects back to episode 3 and your second hypothesis of your research, doesn't it? The cost-benefit analysis problem?
It's the same underlying issue. The investments that would actually drive emission reductions, such as supplier relationship transformation, process redesign, and logistics network optimization, don't fit neatly into traditional capital expenditure frameworks. but a 2 million software platform does. So we systematically favor investments that seem financially prudent over those that would actually be effective.
So we're back to the same systemic barriers we've been finding throughout this research.
Whether it's standards, economics, policy, or technology, we keep discovering the same pattern. The approaches that feel rigorous and professional are often the approaches that prevent actual progress.
Okay, so we've established the problem, but surely you've found some companies that are using technology effectively. What are they doing differently?
And this is where we can inject some optimism into the episode. The companies that use technology successfully all share one characteristic. They treat technology as an enabler, not a strategy. Let me share a few examples. There's an electronics manufacturer, let's call them Electrotech, that implemented what they call targeted digital tools. Instead of comprehensive carbon management platform, they identified 3 specific operational barriers to emission reduction and bought simple tools for each. Barrier 1, they could quickly identify alternative suppliers with lower carbon footprint. Solution, a basic database that cross-references supplier carbon performance with capability. Cost about 30,000 euros to build, saves them weeks every time they need to make a sourcing decision.
That sounds almost underwhelming.
It's not going to win any innovation awards. However, it has reduced their supplier switching time by 60% and their procurement team actually uses this daily. Compare that to all singing, all dancing platforms that cost millions and get used once a month to generate a report. Barrier 2. Logistics providers weren't incentivized to optimize for emission. Solution. They modified their transportation management system to include carbon impact in routing decisions and made it visible in performance scorecards. Cost to modify was about 80,000 euros. Annual emission reduction from optimized routing, 12%.
So small, targeted, specific tools rather than comprehensive platforms.
And barrier 3 is my favorite because it's almost embarrassingly simple. They found that their engineers often specified materials based on technical requirements without considering carbon impact. Not because they didn't care, but because that information wasn't available at the point of decision.
So they integrated carbon data into their CAD system.
Close. They created a simple plugin that showed the estimated carbon footprint of different material choices right in the design interface. Cost was about 50,000 euros to develop, and because it's readily available when engineers make decisions, it actually influenced their choices. They estimate that it has shifted about 30% of their material specifications towards lower carbon options of products to come. Total technology investment overall was 160,000 euros. Total estimated annual emission reduction between 15 to 20%. Compare that to companies spending millions on comprehensive platforms and getting minimal impact.
So the pattern is identify a specific operational barrier, implement the minimum viable technology to address it, and ensure it integrates into existing workflows.
Which sounds so obvious when you say it like that, but our research shows that fewer than 20% of companies take this approach. Most opt for the comprehensive solution that promises to solve everything, only to end up by solving nothing. Action speaks still louder than words, or, in this case, buys.
What about AI? Everyone's talking about how AI will revolutionize supply chains. Does your research support that?
Look, AI has legitimate applications in supply chain decarbonization. Demand forecasting to reduce overproduction, route optimization for logistics, identifying emission patterns in complex data sets. But, and this is critical, AI is only helpful if you're actually going to act on it, what it tells you. I sat through a presentation where a company showed how their AI had identified that 60% of their emissions came from air freight, and switching to ocean freight for non-urgent shipments would reduce emissions by 40%. Brilliant analysis. And when I asked, so have you switched to ocean freight? They said, well, we need to evaluate the inventory holding cost and potential stockouts and.
So the AI did its job, but the humans didn't do theirs.
The AI identified the opportunity. Traditional cost-benefit analysis killed the action. What would have actually helped that company? Not better AI, but a different evaluation framework that properly evaluated emission reduction against inventory cost. And leaders who said, let's do it, we have enough data for now.
It keeps coming back to the same barriers, doesn't it?
It does. This is encouraging in a weird way because it means that we don't have 1,000 different problems to worry about. We have one fundamental problem manifesting in multiple ways. Our governance system, measurement systems, evaluation frameworks, regulatory structures, and technology strategies are all misaligned with the transformation we need to achieve.
So, what about some of these other technologies people keep mentioning? Internet of Things, blockchain, digital twins.
Right, let me address these quickly as they're coming up most frequently. Internet of Things, IoT sensors for real-time monitoring, potentially valuable, but only if you act on the data. I know a company that installed IoT sensors across its warehouse to monitor energy consumption. The sensors worked brilliantly. They identified that the HVAC system was running at full capacity 24/7, including when the warehouse was empty. And then they continued to monitor it for 8 months before anyone actually reprogrammed the HVAC system. 8 months. The sensors had paid for themselves within the first week if they just acted on the data.
So, the problem wasn't technology, it was organizational inertia.
Blockchain, everyone's favorite buzzword still. Yes, blockchain can provide immutable carbon tracking across supply chains, but you know what else provides carbon tracking across supply chains? A structured data sharing agreement with your suppliers in a basic database. Far cheaper, easier to implement, and it actually works. We will address this later when we discuss the EU's latest brilliant legislation, the Digital Product Passport, or DPP. There you can see what bureaucrats make out of the word blockchain in their setting. It is so useless. Now, I'm not saying blockchain has no applications. For every complex multi-tier supply chain where trust is a concern, it may be beneficial. But most companies don't need blockchain. They need their top 50 suppliers to fill out standardized carbon reporting templates and actually reduce emissions in 3 or 4 areas. Not sexy, but effective.
And digital twins, virtual replicas of physical supply chains.
Digital twins are a fascinating technology, truly. They let you model different scenarios, test optimization strategies, and predict failure points. But again, and I don't want to sound like a broken record, they are valuable only if you'll implement the changes they suggest.
Let me guess. Companies build elaborate digital twins and then don't implement any of the recommendations.
Not quite that bad, but close. The research shows that companies with digital twins implemented some changes, but not nearly as many as the models recommended. Why? Because a digital twin identifies optimal solutions from a technical perspective, but those solutions often require complex organizational changes, supplier negotiations, or upfront investments that don't pass traditional financial evaluations. So you end up with an expensive, sophisticated model telling you precisely what to do, and you implement about 30% of it because that's the 30% that fits with existing governance constraints.
That must be incredibly frustrating for the people who built the models.
Oh, it is. I've talked to data scientists who are pulling their hair out. They develop brilliant optimization algorithms that could reduce emissions by 50%, and they watch as management cherry picks the easy recommendations and ignores the ones that could actually make a difference. But here's the thing. It's not that management is stupid or anything. It's that they are operating with systems that make the necessary changes on greenhouse gas emissions illegitimate. You can't blame individuals for systematic financial barriers.
So, what's the solution? Should companies stop investing in technology altogether?
No, absolutely not. However, they need to flip the approach completely. Instead of what technology should we buy to solve our sustainability problem, the question should be what operational changes would actually reduce our emissions and what simple tools do we need to engage those changes.
Start with the transformation, then identify the technology.
And often the technology you need is far simpler than what vendors are selling. One of the highest performing companies in our research in terms of actual emission reduction uses a souped up Excel spreadsheets to track supplier engagement. Nothing fancy. But they had difficult conversation with about 200 suppliers, renegotiated contracts and driven real change. And even if you are using more sophisticated solution, they should enable process changes that you have already identified.
Can we talk about some of the more ridiculous technology pitches you've encountered?
Oh, where to start? I've seen so many AI-powered, blockchain-enabled, IoT-connected solutions that promise to solve every supply chain problems while making coffee and walking your dog. There was one memorable pitch where a vendor promised their platform would use quantum computing to model infinite supply chain scenarios simultaneously and identify the optimal decarbonization pathway.
Wait, quantum computing for supply chain carbon reduction?
And when I asked what specific problem required quantum computing rather than classical optimization, the salesperson said something about unprecedented complexity and infinite variables. What they were actually selling was a fairly standard constraint optimization algorithm with a quantum computing label slapped on it for marketing purposes. You could have literally as well just read the book The Goal by Godred and be thereby updating your MES and ERP systems.
That's amazing. Did anyone buy it?
The terrifying thing is, yes, a major automotive supplier paid an obscene amount of money for it. And as far as I know, it's still being calibrated 2 years later.
So there's real money being spent on these essentially useless tools.
The sustainability technology market is full of solutions looking for problems. And because supply chain decarbonization is such a hot topic and because most executives don't deeply understand the technical details, there's a lot of expensive vaporware being sold.
What's your favorite example of overly complex technology being used for a simple problem?
Okay, this one is brilliant. A company implemented an AI-powered supplier engagement platform that used natural language processing to analyze supplier responses to sustainability questionnaires and flag concerning answers for human review. Quite a mouthful. Sounds sophisticated. The problem was that they were only sending questionnaires to 80 suppliers. A human could have read and analyzed 80 questionnaires in about 2 days. The AI platform cost €200,000 annually and still required human review of flagged responses. When I pointed this out, the head of sustainability said, yes, but it's scalable. To which I replied, scalable to what? Do you plan to have 10,000 suppliers? And he said, well, no, not now, but it might be useful if you do.
So they spent €200,000 annually on scalability they'd never need.
And this is really common. Companies buy enterprise-scale solutions for problems that would be better solved with simple targeted tools. It's like buying a 7.5-ton van because you might someday need to move furniture, even though you just need to pick up groceries right now.
What about some success stories? You mentioned earlier that about 20% of companies are using technology effectively. What are they doing that's actually funny or clever?
Oh, I love some of these. There's a medium-sized manufacturer in Switzerland that realized most of its emission reduction opportunity requires supplier negotiations. So rather than buying a complex supplier management platform, they hired 2 additional people for their procurement team whose sole job was engaging in supplier sustainability. Cost? About 150,000 francs. Results? 22% Scope 3 reduction in 2 years. No fancy technology, just people having conversations and making things happen.
Sometimes the best solution is no technology.
Another company realized their engineers would specify materials based on whatever they'd used before, not because it was optimal, similar like the other company I talked about. So they created what they call the carbon coffee break.
The carbon coffee break?
Every Wednesday, the sustainability team would set up a table with coffee and pastries in the engineering department. Any engineer could stop by, show them what they were working on, and get immediate feedback on lower carbon alternatives. That's it. Coffee, pastries, and a conversation.
That's brilliant, and it costs nothing.
Well, not completely nothing. It's about 3,000 francs per year in coffee and pastries. And it's been more effective than their previous approach of sending engineers to mandatory sustainability training sessions that everyone hated. The beauty of it is that it meets engineers where they are at the moment they're making decisions with relevant information and no judgment. Plus free coffee. You can't underestimate the power of free coffee.
So the pattern is simple, targeted, human-centered approaches often beat sophisticated technological or regulatory solutions.
When it comes to driving behavioral change, absolutely. Technology excels in data collection, processing, and analysis. However, humans are still better at relationship management, negotiation, and creative problem solving that drive actual transformation. The most effective companies utilize technology to support human decision making rather than replace it. They use dashboards to highlight issues, not to pretend the issues don't require human judgment. They use platforms to facilitate conversations, not to substitute for them.
Speaking of innovative ideas, can we discuss the European Union's Digital Product Passport legislation?
Oh yeah, the DPP. The Digital Product Passport is the perfect crystallization of everything wrong with our current approach to sustainability regulation. It's as if the EU reviewed all our research findings on standards, created more reporting and less action, and said, hold my beer, we can make this worse.
Tell us what you really think, Daniel. But seriously, for listeners who aren't familiar, what is the Digital Product Passport?
Right. So the Digital Product Passport, or DPP, is part of EU's eco-design for sustainable product regulation, which came into force in July 2024. The basic idea is that nearly every product sold in the EU must have a digital record containing comprehensive information about its origin, materials, environmental impact, manufacturing history, carbon footprint, recyclability, disposal recommendations, and so on.
That sounds comprehensive.
Comprehensive is one word for it. The first products affected are industrial and electrical vehicle batteries, which need battery passports by February 27. Then it rolls out to textiles, steel, electronics, furniture, tires, detergents, paints, lubricants, toys, essentially everything. Companies have to make these passports accessible by, well, April 2025. So in the past, which for most companies was essentially in the past.
And you're saying this is going to create more problems than it solves?
Let me be precise about this, because it's essential. The intention behind DPP is laudable: to increase transparency, facilitate the circular economy, and help consumers make informed decisions. The implementation, however, is a masterclass in creating compliance theater whilst distracting from actual emission reductions. Here's what actually happened on the ground. Our research revealed that companies with more extensive measurement and reporting standards exhibit less progress in supply chain transformation. The DPP is that finding on steroids.
Can you give us a concrete example?
Absolutely. I'm working with a mid-sized electronics manufacturer in Germany. Let's call them Electro-Widgets. They employ about 400 people with an annual revenue of about 80 million euros. They were making genuine progress on Scope 3 emissions. They engaged their top 30 suppliers, renegotiated contracts to include renewable energy commitments, and were on track for a 20% reduction by 2027. And then the DPP requirement hit. Now they need to create digital passports for approximately 3,000 SKUs, that's stock keeping units. Each passport needs it to include material composition, manufacturing location, carbon footprint, recycling information, and it all needs to be in machine-readable format, uploaded to the EU portal with controlled access levels for different stakeholders.
That sounds like a lot of work.
The company calculated that it needs to hire 3 additional full-time employees just for DPP compliance. That's roughly 200,000 euros per year, plus software systems to manage the passports adds another 50,000 euros upfront, 50,000 annually. And here's the killer. They've had to pull one person off the supplier engagement program to coordinate the DPP implementation. So let me be clear about the trade-off. 400,000 euros in the first year to create digital documentation for the carbon footprint, while simultaneously reducing the resources dedicated to actually lowering the carbon footprint. It's madness.
But surely the transparency will eventually drive improvement. If consumers can see which products have a lower environmental impact, they'll choose those products, creating market pressure for improvement.
That's the theory. The reality? According to a survey of 1,078 German companies in autumn 2024, 2/3 of companies either hadn't heard of DPPs or didn't consider them relevant. Only 4% had actually taken measures to prepare and were now past the deadline for many requirements.
So companies aren't ready?
It's worse than that. The ready companies are predominantly the large corporations with extensive compliance departments. The mid-sized and smaller manufacturers, the ones that actually need support to transform their operations, are drowning in the complexity. And here's the really perverse bit. The regulation creates a situation where companies compete on who has the best compliance system, not who has the lowest actual emissions. I've watched companies present their elaborate DPP frameworks at industry conferences and receive applause, whilst their Scope 3 emissions continue climbing.
This sounds like exactly what your research predicted. Standards implementation, redirecting resources away from transformation.
Our research revealed a negative correlation between the implementation of standards and supply chain changes. The DPP is a perfect case study of that. Let me break that down where the resources are going.
Please do.
A typical mid-sized manufacturer implementing DPP needs to map their entire bill of materials for every product, that's months of work, collect sustainability data from hundreds of suppliers who mostly don't have this data in the required format, then implement software systems that can create machine-readable passports in the mandated format, train staff on data collection, verification, and system management, establish governance processes for ensuring data quality and managing updates, and establish controlled access systems for various stakeholder groups. And here's the catch. Almost none of this work actually reduces emissions. It documents emissions. It creates transparency about emissions. But transparency alone doesn't reduce emissions. Action reduces emissions.
So you're saying the regulation addresses the wrong side of the equation?
The regulation mandates extensive reporting on Scope 3, which accounts for 80% of most companies' emission and originates from their supply chains. However, it doesn't mandate a reduction in Scope 3. It mandates documentation of Scope 3. It's like if we tackled obesity by requiring everyone to wear a digital display showing their calorie intake and body fat percentage, but we didn't actually require or incentivize anyone to eat better or exercise more.
That's a disturbing metaphor, but I see the parallel.
And the timing is particularly painful. These regulations are rolled out between 2024 and 2030, precisely the period where companies need to make aggressive investments in actual emission reductions to have any hope of limiting warming to, well, now probably 2 degrees, because the 1.5 degree limit we already have passed. Instead, we're asking them to spend these critical years building elaborate reporting systems. It's a colossal misallocation of resources at precisely the wrong moment.
What should the regulation have focused on instead?
If we were designing a regulation to actually drive decarbonization, I'd flip the entire approach. Instead of mandating detailed documentation of emissions, mandate actual emission reductions with increasing stringency over time. Set sector-specific targets, require companies to demonstrate year-on-year improvement, create substantial penalties for non-compliance, including losing market access, and use ISO standards to monitor progress. And make the reporting requirements as minimal as possible, just the basic data needed to verify compliance. No elaborate digital passports, no machine-readable formats. Just, here's our baseline, here's our current emissions, here's our trajectory.
So outcome-based regulation instead of process-based regulation.
But that would require politicians and bureaucrats to make uncomfortable choices about how much emission reductions to require and how fast. It's much easier to mandate transparency and kick the hard decisions down the road. The DPP allows regulators to say, we're taking strong actions on climate change, while actually avoiding any requirements that might be economically or politically difficult. It's greenwashing at the regulatory level. In addition, it is merely another attempt to centralize data in the EU, rather than delegating responsibility to independent states and industry associations that are better equipped to support their companies.
That's quite a critique. Is anyone pushing back on this?
Some industry associations are raising concerns about implementation costs and complexity, but they're framed as requests for more extended deadlines or simplified requirements. Very few people are asking the fundamental questions. Will this actually reduce emissions or just document them? And that's the question that matters. Because if we spend the next 5 years building elaborate compliance infrastructure and our emissions don't actually come down, we've failed. The planet doesn't care how sophisticated our reporting systems are. It just heats up due to the concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere, and we will experience more and more the weather consequences of that.
What should companies do? They can't just ignore the regulation.
No, they can't. They need to comply, unfortunately. The penalties for non-compliance will be substantial. However, they should approach DPP compliance with a clear understanding of what it entails. A regulatory obligation that will consume resources but by itself will not reduce emissions. The innovative companies are doing what are called minimal viable compliance plus maximum viable transformation. They're implementing the simplest DPP systems that meet legal requirements, no gold plating, no unnecessary sophistication. And they're protecting their supplier engagement budgets, their operational transformation programs, and their actual emission reduction initiatives. They're treating DPP as a tax, an unavoidable cost of doing business in Europe, but not as a strategy for sustainability. The strategy remains: engage suppliers, modify contracts, optimize logistics, switch to lower carbon materials and energy sources, the things that actually reduce emissions.
This has been quite a reality check regarding sustainability regulations.
Look, I don't enjoy being cynical about this. I desperately want these regulations to work, but our research shows, and the DPP exemplifies, that we are systematically designing regulations that create the appearance of progress while directing resources away from actual progress. Until we fundamentally restructure how we approach sustainability regulations, shifting from transparency mandates to performance requirements, we will continue to see this pattern. More standards, more reporting, higher compliance costs, and no meaningful improvement in environmental outcomes.
As we wrap up, what should listeners take away from this episode?
Here are the key points. First, technology is a tool, not a strategy. If you're investing in technology hoping it will drive transformation, you're doing it backwards. Second, simple and targeted beats comprehensive and sophisticated nearly every time. Identify your specific barriers to emission reduction, then find or build the minimal tool needed to address each one. Third, technology that serves transformation requires acting on the insights it provides. If you're not willing to make complex operational changes, don't waste money on platforms that will simply document your inaction in high-resolution detail. And finally, sometimes the best solution isn't more technology, it's coffee and conversations. Never underestimate the power of human relationships in driving change.
Anything else?
Episode 6 will examine how companies organize themselves, including reporting lines, incentive structures, and siloed departments, and how this either enables or prevents supply chain transformation. Spoiler alert, most organizations' designs are fundamentally incompatible with Scope 3 reduction.
Until then, I will do some reorganization of my databases.
You do that. And while Amy is busy, dear listener, if you have examples of brilliant or ridiculous technology implementations, let's be honest, we all have them, send them to dialogues@helmigadvisory.com. We love hearing your stories, and we might feature you anonymously in one of our next episodes. Until next time, remember the best technology is the one that actually gets used to drive change, not the one that wins innovation awards while sitting unused on a server somewhere. Stay safe, be bold, and see you in 2 weeks. These are the Supply Chain Dialogues produced and copyrighted by Helmig Advisory in 2025.